When I first bought the plot of land, I thought I was making the best decision of my life. After years of city living, crowded apartment buildings, noisy neighbors, and a never-ending battle for parking spaces, I was finally going to have my own home, built exactly the way I wanted. The land wasn't part of any development, it was just a quiet, spacious lot on the edge of a suburban neighborhood, with no homeowners association breathing down my neck. It was perfect. I spent months planning everything, from the architecture to the smallest details like the color of my front door. I wanted a place that felt like home, something modern yet classic, and most importantly, a house that stood tall with high ceilings and big windows to let in natural light. The construction process took time, but every step felt worth it. Then Karen showed up. I noticed her the first time when the foundation was being laid. A middle-aged woman with a scowl permanently etched onto her face, she stood at the edge of my property with arms crossed, glaring at the workers. I didn't think much of it at first. People are naturally curious about new construction in their neighborhood. But Karen's interest was something different. Over the next few weeks, she became a constant presence. She would stand on the sidewalk, muttering under her breath, shaking her head as if my house being built was some personal insult to her existence. One afternoon, as I was going over some final design elements with my contractor, she stomped onto my property uninvited. "This house is too tall," she snapped, eyes narrowed as she took in the steel framework reaching upward. I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" She huffed. "It's too tall. It's blocking my view, and it looks completely out of place in this neighborhood. You need to stop this construction immediately." I stared at her, waiting for some kind of punchline. Surely, she wasn't serious. The height of my house was completely within the legal building code. I had checked and double-checked the zoning laws before even breaking ground. Besides, what view was she talking about? From what I could tell, her house, a generic beige two-story suburban model, faced the street, and my property wasn't even directly in her line of sight. "Ma'am," I said as politely as I could manage, "this is my property. The house design was approved, and it follows all zoning laws. I'm not stopping construction." Her face darkened. "This neighborhood has a look, and your house is ruining it." I glanced around. My house wasn't even finished, and most of the homes around weren't exactly uniform. Some were one-story ranches, others were two-story colonials, and a few had modern renovations. It wasn't an HOA-controlled community, meaning there was no look to conform to. I exhaled, trying to keep my cool. "I understand your concern, but I'm not breaking any laws. If you have an issue, you can take it up with the city." Her eyes narrowed into slits, and she jabbed a finger at my chest. "You'll regret this." With that, she turned and stormed back to her house. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, a city inspector showed up. I had expected a visit at some point, but not this soon, and certainly not because of a complaint. The inspector was professional but apologetic. "We received a report that your house exceeds the height limit for this area." I knew immediately who had made that report. I handed him my permits and construction plans. "Everything is within regulation." He reviewed the documents, nodded, and after a brief walk around the property, confirmed that I was in full compliance. "Everything looks good here. Seems like someone just doesn't like your house." That should have been the end of it. But then came the letters. Karen had somehow rallied a few of the older residents to write complaints, demanding that my house be torn down or at least modified to match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The arguments were ridiculous. Some claimed it cast too much of a shadow, others said it would attract the wrong kind of people. It was clear that this was nothing more than a personal vendetta. I ignored the letters, tossed them in the trash, and focused on finishing my home. That was when Karen escalated. The letters were just the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and soon, she escalated her tactics. It started with minor inconveniences, mysterious calls to my contractors complaining about noise, random complaints filed with the city about supposed violations that didn't exist, and even subtle attempts to make my workers uncomfortable by standing near the site, arms crossed, watching them like a hawk. It was almost amusing at first, but as the days passed, it became clear that she was determined to sabotage my project by any means necessary. I tried ignoring her, thinking she would eventually lose interest, but that was wishful thinking. One morning, I arrived at my property to find a hastily made sign planted near the curb, its bold red letters declaring that my house was destroying neighborhood value and urging residents to protest against its construction. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. I removed the sign, tossed it aside, and kept moving forward. My house was nearly complete, the walls fully up, the roof in place, and the finishing touches coming together. But Karen wasn't done. A few nights later, I was woken by a loud banging at my door. I groggily pulled myself out of bed, unsure if I was still dreaming, but the knocking didn't stop. I checked the time, 2:47 a.m. My stomach tightened. No one had any reason to be at my property at this hour. As I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before peeking through the peephole. Standing there, wrapped in a robe and looking absolutely livid, was Karen. Her face was illuminated by my porch light, her arms flailing as she knocked again. I wasn't about to entertain whatever nonsense she had planned in the middle of the night, so I turned around and walked away, letting her pound on the door until she got tired. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I heard her muttering something before she stormed away. I figured she had finally hit the limit of her persistence, but I underestimated her ability to take things even further. The next day, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. 2 officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they approached. My first instinct was that something serious had happened, but the moment they spoke, I realized exactly what this was about. Karen had called them, reporting that my house was violating city code and claiming it was a safety hazard. I handed over my permits again, explained the situation, and the officers, clearly annoyed at being dragged into a petty dispute, nodded along before assuring me that there was nothing illegal about my construction. They left after a short inspection, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk as she watched them drive away. I thought that was the end of it, but later that evening, I heard my name being whispered when I walked past a group of neighbors. Karen had been spreading lies, telling everyone that my house was an eyesore, that it was blocking sunlight, that I was some reckless developer with no regard for the community. Some people believed her, others didn't care, but a few had started giving me looks whenever I walked past, muttering to each other as if I had personally offended them by building my home. It was infuriating, but I wasn't about to let Karen dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own property. I pushed forward, ignoring the cold stares and whispers, focusing on what really mattered, finishing my home and finally settling in. Then the real sabotage began. One morning, I arrived to find deep scratches on my newly installed windows, almost as if someone had taken a sharp object and deliberately carved into the glass. A few days later, tire marks appeared on my freshly paved driveway, like someone had spun their wheels in frustration before speeding off. But the worst was when my contractor called me in a panic, saying someone had reported my house as unoccupied and abandoned, which meant the city had been asked to investigate whether it needed to be condemned. It was a ridiculous accusation, but it forced an unnecessary inspection, delaying my progress yet again. At this point, it was clear that Karen wasn't just an angry neighbor, she was on a mission. The delays were frustrating, but they weren't enough to stop me. I knew Karen wanted me to give up, to be so overwhelmed by the constant obstacles that I would either sell the property or make drastic changes to please her. But I wasn't about to do either. The inspections came and went, with officials confirming every time that my house was fully legal, my permits were in order, and there was no violation of any kind. Every attempt Karen made to weaponize city regulations against me failed, yet she never seemed to run out of ideas. It became a game of endurance. How long could I hold out before she found another way to escalate? I didn't have to wait long for her next move. One evening, just as the last of my workers were packing up for the day, I noticed a group of people gathered near the sidewalk. Karen was at the center, talking animatedly while waving her hands in exaggerated gestures. She had managed to pull together a small group of like-minded residents, most of them older homeowners who had probably lived in the neighborhood for decades and saw any change as a threat. I wasn't sure what she was telling them, but judging by their disapproving expressions and occasional glances in my direction, it wasn't good. I didn't engage. If they wanted to stand around and grumble about my house, so be it. But then, the next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. I rushed outside to find two men setting up a massive sign directly in front of my property, just inches from the curb. The sign was professionally printed, bold, and impossible to ignore. It read, "Stop the construction. Protect our neighborhood." Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a website link to a petition that I could only assume was Karen's latest desperate attempt to gather support against me. I stared at the sign for a long moment, anger bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't just petty complaints anymore, this was a direct attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against me. But I wasn't going to take the bait. I pulled out my phone, took a few photos, and then calmly walked back inside. If Karen wanted a battle, I was going to make sure she lost. I sent the photos to my lawyer, who had already been keeping track of Karen's harassment. Within an hour, I had a legal response drafted and ready to be delivered. The sign was on public property but directly targeting me in a way that could be considered defamation. More importantly, the petition itself contained blatant lies, including claims that my house was violating zoning laws, that it was a dangerous structure, and that it was lowering property values by tens of thousands of dollars. My lawyer assured me that we had a strong case if I wanted to pursue legal action, but I decided to wait. I wanted to see how far Karen was willing to go before I made my move. That night, I noticed something strange. A car was parked across the street, its headlights off, the silhouette of a person barely visible inside. It was there for over an hour, unmoving, just watching. When I finally stepped outside, the car immediately started and drove away. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. Karen wasn't just trying to stop my construction anymore. She was watching, waiting for something she could use against me. I kept my cool, knowing that the moment I lost my temper, she would twist it into proof that I was the problem. Instead, I did the opposite. I kept my head down, focused on my house, and refused to react. But Karen was relentless. Over the next few days, small things started happening. My mail mysteriously went missing. A neighbor I had never spoken to before confronted me on the street, demanding to know why I was ruining their community. The petition gained more signatures, though most of them seemed to be from people who had never even set foot near my property. Then came the final straw. Late one evening, just as I was locking up, I heard a noise outside, something rustling near the fence. I stepped onto my porch, and for a split second, I saw a shadowy figure darting away, disappearing into the night. I walked down to check, and that's when I saw it. Spray-painted in large, messy letters across the side of my garage was a single word, "Leave." The sight of that word scrawled across my garage sent a cold surge of anger through me. This wasn't just Karen's petty interference anymore, this was vandalism, a clear attempt to intimidate me into leaving. The spray paint was fresh, the chemical smell still lingering in the night air, and I knew whoever had done it hadn't been gone long. I clenched my jaw, my heart pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. Reacting impulsively was exactly what they wanted. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos from every angle, and filed a police report that same night. The officer who arrived took one look at the graffiti inside, clearly used to handling neighborhood disputes that had spiraled out of control. He noted down the details, asked if I had any security cameras, and assured me they'd keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. But I could tell from his tone that nothing was going to come of it. Whoever did this had slipped away without a trace, and without clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I spent the next morning scrubbing the paint off my garage, every stroke of the brush reinforcing my determination. I wasn't going anywhere. If Karen thought she could scare me into submission, she was dead wrong. The act of vandalism only made me more resolute. But even as I worked, I could feel eyes on me. Neighbors passed by, some watching with curiosity, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Karen wasn't in sight, but I had no doubt she knew exactly what had happened. By midday, I had repainted the section, erasing every trace of the message meant to drive me away. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen had played every card she had: complaints, lies, smear campaigns, even harassment. Now, she had resorted to outright criminal behavior, and that meant she was running out of options. A cornered opponent was the most dangerous kind. That evening, I installed security cameras, covering every angle of my property. Motion-activated lights now lined my driveway, and I made sure every permit and legal document was backed up and easily accessible in case I needed them again. If Karen wanted to keep fighting, I was ready. But the next move wasn't hers, it was mine. My lawyer had been gathering evidence for weeks, compiling every complaint, false claim, and instance of harassment into a detailed report. Now, with the police report added to the file, we had enough to take real action. I sent her the latest updates, and within days, a formal cease and desist letter was delivered to Karen's doorstep. The shift was immediate. The very next day, Karen was outside, pacing her driveway, phone pressed to her ear as she waved her free hand in frustration. She was talking fast, her face flushed with anger, her movements jerky and exaggerated. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know exactly what was happening. She had spent months waging a war against me, convinced she held all the power. Now, for the first time, she was realizing that I wasn't just some random newcomer she could push out of her perfect little world. I was standing my ground, and I had the law on my side. For the next few days, things were eerily quiet. The petition disappeared from the website. The sign in front of my house was taken down. The whispers in the neighborhood faded, replaced by awkward silence whenever I walked past. Even Karen, who had once made it her mission to be everywhere at once, was suddenly absent from her usual spots. But I didn't let my guard down. The most dangerous people weren't the ones who raged openly, they were the ones who plotted in silence. And Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. I was proven right when, exactly a week later, 2 more police cruisers pulled into my driveway. I watched from my porch as the officers stepped out, their expressions serious but unreadable. One of them held a file in his hand, flipping through the pages as he approached. I already knew what this was. Karen had made her final, desperate move. She had officially filed a legal complaint against me, claiming that my house was a structural hazard and was causing distress and disruption in the neighborhood. It was nonsense, of course, but it was enough to force another city inspection and drag me into a formal dispute. I stayed calm as the officers explained the situation, nodding along as they laid out the details of the complaint. Then, without hesitation, I handed them my permits, legal documents, and the cease and desist letter that had already been issued against Karen. I saw the shift in their expressions as they read through the paperwork, realization dawning that this wasn't a case of some reckless homeowner breaking the rules, this was a targeted harassment campaign that had escalated to the point of legal intervention. The older officer sighed, closing the file and shaking his head slightly before looking back at me. He muttered something under his breath about how these neighborhood disputes were always the worst kind of headaches. Then he turned, looking over at Karen's house, where she was peeking through her blinds, watching the scene unfold. It was over. She just didn't know it yet. The moment the officers left, Karen must have realized her last attempt had failed. She had thrown everything she had at me: complaints, lies, harassment, vandalism, and even legal threats, but every single time, I had stood my ground. She had hoped the system would work in her favor, that I would be buried under bureaucracy and pressure, but instead, all she had done was dig herself into a deeper hole. I wasn't just another neighbor she could bully into submission. I had the law, evidence, and sheer determination on my side, and now, everyone knew it. The next morning, I woke up to an unexpected sight. Karen's house, which had been the center of so much chaos, had a "for sale" sign planted firmly in the front yard. I stood at my window, staring at it for a long moment, barely able to believe what I was seeing. After all the noise, the drama, the ridiculous fight she had waged against me, she was leaving. The sign was fresh, the bright red lettering standing out like a final surrender. A part of me expected her to drag things out longer, to find some other way to make my life miserable, but deep down, I knew she had no other choice. The entire neighborhood had seen her fail. The police had seen her lies. The city had dismissed her claims. There was nowhere left for her to go except away. In the following days, her presence faded like a bad memory. The neighbors who had once sided with her now kept their distance, embarrassed by how they had been caught up in her ridiculous campaign. The few who had remained neutral now saw the truth of what had happened. Karen had never been protecting the neighborhood. She had been protecting her own fragile ego, unwilling to accept that someone new had arrived and dared to do things differently. Her moving process was quiet, almost unceremonious. There were no dramatic final confrontations, no parting threats. Just a moving truck pulling into her driveway one morning, a few workers loading up furniture, and Karen herself walking in and out of her house with an expression I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was humiliation. Maybe it was just exhaustion from a battle she had never been meant to win. I didn't approach her, didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. By the end of the week, she was gone. Just like that, the woman who had made my life a living nightmare had vanished, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and a bad reputation. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for months. People stopped whispering when I walked past. Some even nodded at me now, as if they had suddenly remembered I was a person and not just the target of Karen's paranoia. And then, something even more surprising happened. A few days after she left, a man knocked on my door. He introduced himself as the new head of the neighborhood council, an older guy named Leonard, who had been living here for years but had mostly stayed out of the drama. He apologized for how things had played out, admitted that Karen had been a problem for a long time, and told me that her departure had been a relief for more people than I realized. I wasn't expecting that. I had assumed most of the neighborhood had been against me, but as it turned out, a lot of people had simply been too afraid to stand up to her. Karen had controlled things through intimidation and manipulation for years, and my refusal to bow to her had, in a way, set a new precedent. Over time, things settled. The neighborhood meetings became less about petty grievances and more about actual improvements. People who had once avoided me now made casual conversation when I was outside working on my house. A few even asked me about my design choices, saying that maybe a little change wasn't such a bad thing after all. It was strange, seeing how quickly people could shift once the root of the problem was gone. As for my house, it stood exactly as I had envisioned it, tall, strong, and finally at peace. Every brick, every window, every inch of the structure that Karen had fought so hard against remained untouched, a testament to the fact that I had won, not just against her, but against the idea that people like her had the power to dictate the lives of others. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized just how much had changed. The house I had fought so hard to build was now a home. The neighborhood that had once been hostile was now neutral, if not welcoming. And most importantly, Karen, the woman who had spent months trying to tear me down, was nothing more than a name people muttered when they talked about how things used to be. I had won. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I could finally enjoy the life I had built without looking over my shoulder.